I believe Apalachin was about the expansion of the heroin distribution in the U.S. Because I don't know if you know this, you probably do, and those watching probably do. There was a very important meeting in 1957 at the Hotel Les Palms in Sicily, in Palermo.
Oh, yeah.
And it was like Luciano, Joe Bonanno, Tommaso Buscetta, the mafiosi over in Sicily.
Vito
And they got
Genovese.
together to say, hey, you know what? You guys are going to take care of this route, and you guys are going to import to the U.S. Then the American Cosa Nostra was going to take it and then distribute it to the 26 cities. I believe that the Apalachin meeting was simply to talk. That was the number one thing on the agenda. I really don't believe it was, well, Vito Genovese was, getting made. He's the new boss. I don't think that was it. I really think it was around the heroin distribution. So my question to you, though, is let's fast forward to the 80s, right? When I know his story is interesting, but yeah, I like you. Welcome to jump in a few minutes if you're okay. But for now, for Jeff. So what I wanted to say was, why would it from the business perspective, especially when the coke is getting big in the 80s, Rizzuto's and the Canadian mob bought from the Cali cartel. The Sicilian mob has been buying from Pablo, right? The Calabrians were buying from eventually the Mexicans. Why did America Cosa Nostra kind of say, you know what, we're done with the heroin, or we have the heroin network? Why not insert cocaine into that same network? Why do you think?
You have to often wonder. And we remember Chris Rosenberg would ultimately be killed for that obsession. He went down and tried to mess with Cubans, and it ended up being the undoing for him. Yeah, that's something that I know you talk with Bobby about. I never understood that. The party drug, right? Because in the 80s, 70s, and coke was huge. I mean, it was a big money maker. Yep. I can understand you don't want to get involved with crack and things like that because you have to do a little bit more work, and it's it's good profit, but it's not as easy. Yeah, I never understood that myself. And by that point, remember, by the time cocaine had its real moment in the sun in like the 70s and 80s, we were at a point in the mafia where, again, I think if you're someone like Salerno and some of these big bosses, you're looking at it and saying it's way more trouble than it's worth. We're making hundreds of millions of dollars doing what we're doing.
Construction and whatever they were doing.
Right. And if you remember, Tom, one of the great, and I know it's a film, but if you remember early in the Gotti film, when Gambino asked Gotti to kill McBratney for the thing, he says, the mob or the police can look past a lot of things, not drugs, right?
Yeah.
And again, I think that's really valid. Like, even today, like you get hit way harder with a drug offense than you do with extortion, So I think it's just simply that. But I always have wondered about the cocaine thing for sure.
So I have a theory which buttresses kind of what you're saying is, by then, and then Bobby kind of said this too. We didn't get, I don't know why. I should have brought it up on the interview, but we were chatting before, and he kind of said part of the problem is in the 90s, which we could argue when the twilight was. Some people could say 89. Some people could argue mid 90s. Some could argue late 90s. Some could argue 2005. So, we all kind of agree for the most part, the 90s was the twilights at some point, either beginning of the end or the end. And according to Bobby, by the 90s, there were wars in Philly. There were wars in Boston. The Patriarchas got decimated. I know that the Cavalcantes got decimated. So basically, they didn't even have the organization or the bandwidth or, frankly, the juice to maybe go to the Colombians and say, hey, we got this. I think that part is part of the problem. What do you think about that?
Well, I will say there's one comment I want to talk about. I think Drita 5K is totally right. Like, I think there is a lot of hype that they weren't selling drugs. Look, I don't know if within Genovese's and certain families that, but the Gambinos, they definitely were. And if you go down to Philadelphia, I've talked with you before about Long John Martirano, who was selling drugs under Angelo Bruno. He was the meth guy in Philadelphia. Everyone was buying P2P off Long John. So again, remember, this was all going on. Bruno was letting people move drugs. Everybody was moving drugs. But as far as just that, I think that's a great point. I mean, we'll never know how much exactly they were making. But remember, even during the Gotti reign and right before the Gotti reign, who was selling drugs? Ruggiero, Gene Gotti. I mean, they were all selling weight.
Well, the reason why Angelo got involved, in my opinion, was his brother passed, and his brother was a big time drug dealer. That's why he didn't want to get made, and I think he inherited it. I think it was like this fell in his lap, and it was big money, and I think it jammed him up.
Yeah, I think another thing, to answer your question earlier, why didn't they get involved in the 70s, 80s? Remember back in the 40s and 50s, it was so much harder to get convicted of really any crime as opposed to it was, 70s or 80s. The drug laws were a lot different. Remember in the 80s, the war on drugs started. And the federal government really came down hard on drug dealers. So I don't know. I think it will never be. And look, the mob's never going to be what it was in the 50s and 60s. That's just that simple. But yeah, they were all doing it, and they'll say they weren't, but they were.
Well, the other thing is, like you said, I think the old timers had money at that point. Castellano, Bob even said it was legitimate multimillionaire. Yeah, Tony Salerno, I mean, Vinicin. These guys were probably worth upwards of 20, 30, even $50 million. So I get it. You don't want to rock the boat. But I think the two reasons were bigger heat, which how much more heat can you get than Giuliani? And number two is they were worried about informants because the numbers are bigger. My thing is there were still a lot of informants anyway. I would say if they got involved with drugs, right, and they did it correctly, and again, we're going to talk about today or soon, recent. So I get the aversion to it. I get it, right? But also, conversely, if they got involved with it because they had the infrastructure, that would have brought a fuck ton of money in it. With money buys power, right? Yeah. So I want to kind of, and I know you appreciate.
Remember though, Tom, this is why the mob as well. I mean, other than the law enforcement angle, because let's remember, there's no group that's been targeted more in history than the mob. It's that simple. Like, correct. For decades, the FBI didn't even know that black organized